Okay, welcome back to our study of the worlds of the 15th century, and now we're going to compare China and Europe. Keep your attention focused on issues of comparison and the interconnections among the regions of the world. This is the last chapter in which the Americas, Australia, and Afro-Eurasia are separated and not part of one global network. Remember, in Chapter 9, we learned that Islamic society was composed of much more than just Arab influences. And in this chapter, Islam is viewed through the distinctively non-Arab empires, the heartland of the Ottomans and the Safavids, the frontiers of the Songhai and the Mughals, and even the mention of the Chinese Muslim Zheng revealed the vast diversity of Islamic society throughout the 15th century world. And the examination of civilizations in the Americas moves beyond the city-state model of the Maya that we learned about in Chapter 6 to the imperial structure of the Aztecs and the Incas. The political systems of each of these large American empires provide a good model for the comparative study of the techniques of imperial rule. And with this section, China and Europe are discussed together several times, actually, throughout this chapter, most notably while describing the developmental arc immediately before the rise of a global system. And so think about whether the early Ming represents a time similar to the European Renaissance, or whether Europe had the conditions similar to China when it came to cross-ocean exploration. So this is just as the hemispheres were about to be permanently linked. Okay, by the 15th century CE, a majority of the world's population lived within a major civilization. Let's start with Ming Dynasty, China. China had been badly disrupted by Mongol rule and the plague, known as the Black Death. And there were recovery efforts under the Ming Dynasty, which lasted 1368 to 1644. And there were massive efforts to eliminate all signs of foreign rule. A promotion of Confucian learning was reestablished along with the civil service examination. And the Emperor Yongle sponsored an 11,000 volume encyclopedia summarizing all of the wisdom of the past. And, you know, that actually was not the only important project to get China back on track after the Mongols. There were public works, building a new capital complete with new temples and courts, overseas missions that went along with this writing this enormous encyclopedia. The Chinese recreated a highly centralized government. They had done this, of course, in the past, and they went back to their roots by creating a highly centralized government where power was given to court eunuchs. A state restored land to cultivation that had been damaged by the Mongols. They constructed waterworks and planted perhaps 1 billion trees, and was perhaps the best governed and most prosperous civilization of the 15th century. And so we see a huge economic boom as the Ming repaired infrastructure in those fields and setting in motion substantial economic growth. They also undertook maritime ventures. The Chinese sailors and traders had become important in the South China Sea and Southeast Asian ports in the 11th century. And so Emperor Yongle commissioned a massive fleet, which was launched in 1405. And it's one of the most remarkable moments in the Ming Dynasty, as these massive fleets, commanded by Admiral Zheng took hundreds of ships with approximately 27,000 men and sailed the China Seas and the Indian Ocean just to demonstrate Chinese power. However, this mission was not to colonize or conquer, but rather a trade mission that encouraged the expansion of the tribute state system. But this fleet was suddenly recalled in the 1430s, and the Ming turned away from sending merchants out to the world and thought a better way to get tribute is by letting the world come to China. Now, despite that, the Chinese merchants and craftsmen continued to settle and trade in Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, however, without government support, as they regarded these voyages as a waste of resources. Okay, so let's go to Europe, the state building and cultural renewal in Western Europe. Okay, there was a similar process of demographic recovery after the Black Death, as numbers have been thrown around anywhere from 1/4 of the population to 2/3 of the population dying from the Black Death. Nonetheless, a large amount of people. And so there's also a process of demographic recovery, consolidation, even a cultural flowering, which is known as the Renaissance, and a European expansion as well that took place in Western Europe. The European population began to rise again around 1450, and even took on tasks of state building, albeit fragmented, with many independent and competitive states. And they were constantly in conflict with each other, which is in contrast to China. As the Chinese reunified, Europe was a region divided into many smaller states, so never regained that imperial or empirical stature that they had with the Roman Empire. But they remained in these smaller states that were in near constant conflict with each other. A great example is the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between France and England. But we see this reclamation of classical Greek traditions and Roman traditions known as the Renaissance. And the Renaissance humanism really started in northern Italy. We see the revival of the Greco-Roman art and philosophy, and by focusing on the achievements of individuals and on real-world practicalities, the ideology of the Renaissance humanism was seen as a direct challenge to the otherworldly spiritualism of the church. So this began about 1350, 1500. I know it's a wide range, it's 150 years, but remember, we're talking about historical processes and developments that take years really to develop. And so this returning to the sources was a cultural standard to imitate, for example. Turn to greater naturalism in art like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael. And these humanist scholars explored secular topics in addition to those religious matters. And one of the great authors is an Italian-French woman, Christine de Pizan, who wrote against misogyny or the hatred of women. And these Renaissance thinkers were more concerned with describing the world as it is rather than exploring some great unknown eternal truth. So let's compare the maritime voyages. We talked about Zheng He in China, and now let's look at European exploration. The Portuguese voyages of discovery began in about 1415. And by 1492, Columbus had reached the Americas. In 1497 to 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa and made it to India. And the European voyages, in terms of size, were considerably smaller compared to the Chinese ones. And unlike the Chinese voyages, Europeans were seeking wealth, Christian converts, and even allies in the Crusades against Islam, as opposed to seeking tribute or demonstrating power. And the Europeans used violence to carve out empires. And as the Chinese voyages ended, the European ones actually kept escalating and grew in grandeur and size. There's no overarching political authority in Europe to end the voyages, because many of these small competing states or kingdoms continued to try and outdo one another seeking that wealth, especially between Spain, Portugal, and then later the Dutch and the English. Now, rivalry between the states is really what encouraged more exploration, and much of the European elite was interested in overseas expansion and colonization. China had everything, well, they believed they had everything that they needed, And so they didn't need to expand, while the Europeans wanted the greater riches of the East. As the Indian Ocean trade developed, probably sometime during the Middle Ages, European Middle Ages, Dark Ages, into the 15th century, Europeans more and more wanted to be involved. They were interested in those luxuries from the East. And as they began to compete against one another for that wealth, and deciding to travel west to get east, thinking the earth was much smaller than what it was, the Americas are discovered. And so they continue to want greater and greater riches, and competing with each other, and really interested in expanding even overseas, and not just economically. Remember, they were also looking for Christian converts, as well as wealth, and even allies to fight against Islam. Now, China's food production could expand internally, while the European system expanded by acquiring new lands. These small kingdoms, as I just said, they're small and they need to look outwards to get new sources. But China is vast; it's huge, millions of people, lots of resources, and I mean, they're right. They had a lot of what they needed, and so they didn't have to necessarily look outward. They could focus internally, while the Europeans had to look outward. And with so many different kingdoms, there was no real one power or one emperor to keep these voyages in check. Okay, so here is the image of, the map of Europe, roughly at about this time, and you see it's significantly different than what it looks like now. Of course, we'll learn more about the Ottoman Empire, and here are some places where the Mongols have not necessarily been kicked out yet. And then, of course, is what develops into a large portion of Russia, as the Kievan Rus are up here in the northeastern part of Europe. And here's the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, Charlemagne was the first Holy Roman Emperor crowned by the Pope. And of course, the Italian city-states and papal states here in Italy, specifically up here where the Renaissance began. But some of the boundaries are very similar, if not the same as today, like, for example, Portugal and Spain. France is a little bit different, but very similar. Obviously, like Cologne and some of these places are in France now. Okay, and here's your map showing the Ming Dynasty in China, and Timur's Ottoman Empire in about 1405, and the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughals in India, and also even the routes of those voyages that were sponsored by the Ming Dynasty. And I know it shows the Songhai Empire in Ethiopia, and even Great Zimbabwe down here, and we'll get into that later on in this chapter. But this map also does show the Portuguese voyages of exploration. And of course, you see parts of the Chinese maritime voyages. But it's also important to note, and we'll get into this later, the movement of the Fulbe people in Africa. So it's great to see how Portugal took the lead after 1450. With the support of the Pope, they launched a series of voyages that culminated in Vasco da Gama leaving Portugal for India in 1497. Go back to it. There we go. Columbus sailed for Portugal's rival Spain, and he's the one that reached the Americas in 1492. And smaller ships and fleets than the Chinese, considerably smaller. The most obvious contrast between the two is the size of the the ships and the fleets. Right? Shanghai had hundreds of ships with tens of thousands of men, while the Iberians, that would be the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain, just sent out a handful of ships with crews around maybe 100 or so, give or take. And this showed a dramatic difference in power and wealth. And of course, their motives were different. As China was already wealthy, it had no real need to expand overseas. China was highly centralized. The state decided what to do, when to do it, thus ending the voyages when they felt it was necessary, and could do so very quickly, while the Europeans, on the other hand, were desperate to break into this larger world economy, seeing how backwards that they were. And as Europe was divided into this number of competing states, almost all of whom were in competition with the Islamic world, there was a sense that if a state did not take to the seas, it would lose out to its rivals. And in Europe, merchants saw economic opportunities, monarchs saw new tax revenues, the church saw a way to expand the faith. So thus there were many more push factors in the poorer and isolated European people than there were in the wealthy and confident Chinese. And that finishes up section 2. See you guys next time.